Thank you for taking the time this morning to join this IPSOS Insights session with us. I'm very happy to introduce my colleague Colin, who's joining us from London this morning, very early for you.
Oh.
And Colin is our Global Head of Behavioral Science, and I've working with him for 3 months where I was joining the UK unit. And that's also why I'm actually based in Denmark now, but it's part of what we call IPSOS Behavior Change Network, and that's why we're hosting this morning session for you today, explaining how to make change happen using behavioral science and how to apply it in a number of different industries. So yeah, I think we could kick it off. If you have any comments, any questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section. For now, we'll check in once in a while, but we will make a lot of time in the end to ensure that all your questions are answered, so we can have a bit of debate. If there's anything that's unclear, you want to know more about, please feel free to just let us know.
Great. Okay, shall we let's dive in, and just to echo your comments, so good morning, good to be here, nice to be talking to you about this really interesting topic. And I guess that behavioral science is one of these things which has been around for a while now, and many people have sort of read the books by Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow, and Ariely and sort of Predictably Irrational and so on. Really interesting, doesn't it? And I think that we've all had these sorts of sense of, look, there's something to be had from this discipline, but what is it? How do we actually apply it? And I think that's what we want to take you through in a fairly. We'll canter through this a little bit this morning, just to give you a bit of a sense of the sorts of things we do and how we apply it in a case study, so you can see. But it's as our title suggests, it's all about change. Behavioral science is all about, from our perspective, and how we apply it across Ipsos, and working together across our footprint. It's all about how do we integrate this with the research which we do in order to help you make change happen. Because after all, as strategists, as marketeers, as policymakers, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make change happen. So behavioral science offers us a really great scaffolding to help us to do that. It's worth just sort of saying a word or two up front about the times in which we live, and it's perhaps hard to ignore the times in which we live. The very fact that we're on this, we're doing this via a digital platform, rather than having sort of got together in person, tells us something very pertinent about the way in which we're currently living now. And I think that we've made the point that COVID has obviously changed a lot, but there's a lot going on before COVID, of course. Lots of issues around migration and aging populations and climate change and digital. These are all very disruptive things for ourselves and for our environment. And so what does that mean, and for how we operate? So I think what it means is that perhaps in the more recent past, we're able to operate in a world which is a little bit more, shall we say, predictable. It's a little bit more kind of sense of what happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow and the next day. But COVID has somehow crystallized a lot of these transformative and disruptive forces in a way which has meant that actually it's quite hard to navigate the world. It's a little bit kind of, things are sort of unpredictable and quite fluid, and what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid times. It's like we're walking in this kind of quicksand. We're always having to make sort of rethink and calculate and work out how to make decisions. So in a sense, it's hard navigating this, and that means is that people have to be fairly flexible and adapt to change. So in this context, we perhaps need to rethink a little bit about the content of behavioural science. What do we, what theories are we referring to? Because behavioural science is a huge discipline. It's a many people would put into behavioural science sociology and anthropology and human geography, but often in terms of the conversation in marketing, it ends up being looking at things like System 1 and nudging and habits, and those are relevant. Those are part of what we do, and those are interesting and attractive and fun quite often. I mean, there's a use case of the piano staircase that sort of played notes as people go up the stairs to sort of encourage people, nudging people to go up the stairs, and they can work, but they work in quite constrained situations, of what we would call final mile type situations. And bear in mind that most decisions, so for example, point of sale type decisions. But bear in mind, most decisions are made before points of sale. So, these are part of the solution, but they're not the whole story. The piano staircase, interestingly, got taken out after 2 days because people were so irritated by the notes being made every time you go up the stairs. You can imagine the first time you do it, it's fun. The second time it's like, okay, yeah, I remember this now. Third time, you're rushing on your way to work, and it's just like, really? Please stop. So the point is, in a more predictable environment, then more automatic theories like nudging, like habit, like System 1 are helpful and useful. They're good theoretical frames to help us understand the environment and the behaviour of ourselves in that environment which we're in. But now we are in a fundamentally different environment. We need to be thinking about how can we help consumers more holistically navigate change. Now, one of the questions which we'll often get then is, look, okay, so it's changed, but what kind of questions do you deal with? And I think there's lots of different ways in which we can be addressing change questions. And let's face it, we don't always necessarily see briefs which say, please, let's have the science of behaviour change here. But the sorts of things which we look out for from briefs, where we think, okay, is this relevant? Is there where the business challenge is relevant? Look, if there's a behaviour that's happening that's problematic, we want to change. People are doing something, and we feel like actually that this is a problem. We need to sort of align in terms of more positive outcomes. Something isn't being done enough of. So people are doing something. Perhaps a bit of recycling, but actually we need to do more of it. Maybe we need to require a fundamentally new behaviour. We're introducing a new product or something. We actually want people to think about a new type of product. How can we encourage people to take this up? Or let's say, and this is a question we get a lot, if there is a behaviour which has been started, say during this period of sort of COVID and health protection measures, how do we go about maintaining this behaviour? So these are all kind of areas in which we look for ways in which we can help and facilitate change, and you can kind of often sum these up in terms of a say-do gap. Often there is people want to do something, but they're struggling to actually deliver on it, and these are sort of different ways in which that say-do gap can often be expressed, and that's where we tend to have a role to play. And I think, Rika, you've been thinking about this in terms of the kind of questions you get in the within Denmark, right?
Yeah, definitely. So lots of the time we see questions being asked in terms of a product or a specific piece of information that the brief is about. But what we're actually tackling is a much more underlying change behavior and attitude that we would like to tap into, and we would like to enable with the client product, more or less. So for instance, in the shape of packs, how do we ensure that our products are disposed in a proper manner, and how can we enable this? This is the underlying factor for a pack shape that's conducted it with the third moment of truth in mind, and something to further foster the global moderation trend in the context of indulgence. How can we help people balance this sweet spot? We know this is on a lot of our clients' minds, just in terms of specific questions, not the underlying habits, so to speak. Then when we're talking about new behavior, we see that depending situation on how to interact with each other in the future, with increased emphasis on hygiene, what is that going to look like, and how can we as dominant players in the Danish context and also globally, be a part of making the habits and ensuring that we do this in a responsible manner and support this, enable this with our products. And then in terms of maintaining, for instance, we have the recipe boxes. So in the Danish context, it's very much a company like Nemlig.com that has increased their online traction. But that doesn't only happen for Nemlig.com, but it happens to a lot of people during these times. And what we can help with is to look at the online traction you had during COVID. And when we're then going to more offline friendly times, how are you then going to maintain this sort of behavior with the online traction that you would like to see from your consumers?
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there, like in terms of the we quite often get the question, what behaviours are going to stick? And in a sense, that's quite a passive way of looking at it. It's like the question is more, what can we do in order to help to make sure this behavior sticks? So actually, as a brand, you aren't passive. You have an active role in facilitating and maintaining those sorts of behaviors. And I think that's the thing we talk about quite often, I think, between ourselves, isn't it? Like in terms of, well, how do we manage that and how do we facilitate it? And this is where we get into applying behavioral science. So and this is about about change. So I think it's worth saying something a little bit about how we see the practice and how we apply the practice of behavioral science here at Ipsos, because I think and just to explain our setup a little bit, because there's the practice of behavioral science has been located in this kind of lone expert model, the kind of okay, let's get the real expert, and we can only rely on them in order to help us solve the problem, and many professions started out like that. I mean, after all, market research in a sense started out like that, and that's really where behavioural science is quite a lot at the moment. There's a lot of focus around the sort of academic linkages. I myself am an honorary professor at a university. You know, I'm very tapped into those sorts of academic networks, and but you know, our job and the job we've been working on together at Ipsos and working together with people like Riker is to say that how do we standardize this? You know, how do we take that expertise and codify it, bake it into our propositions, and then make sure that we then got proper governance and certification and quality management going on, because really we need to make sure that as an organization at Ipsos, we've got, 80 countries, isn't it, Riker? It's, 16,000 employees. We need to make this part of, and we are making this part of our wider DNA. And then the next stage on from that is to be using technology to systematize more. So we bring it, we're then supporting that with technology, making it even more efficient. So the point is that all disciplines go through stages of development, all disciplines, and behavioral science is no there's no exception to that. So we need to do this to be a strategic partner globally with our global clients, and so therefore that's why we are operating in this way with a network of practitioners and change practitioners trained in our tools and tapped into our sort of global network in order to facilitate this.
And the way we actually do it, so this is a global collaboration, as mentioned. The overall approach we adopt to address this behavioral challenge is what we call a change lab. So it's a clear process where we go from a change challenge and then in clear stages move to create a set of interventions to drive behavior change. And this is naturally all underpinned by behavioral science, but also designed in a way that's accessible and understandable in a manner. We need to be on board with every step of the way. We don't want this black box understanding of what's going on. At the core, of course, is the consumers, the consumer panel in every step of the way, from diagnosing to designing and delivering interventions or whatever the outcome might be. It's really, really important that we always check in. And this is sort of where the two branches of what Colin's been talking about really comes together and clarifies the needs and the actions that needs to be taken to tackle these.
No, absolutely. And I think it's having this clear, systematic approach that we take means that we can all understand how behavioural science is applied. And so, as Rika was saying, first of all, we're saying, well, what is the behavioural challenge? Then look, what's using our framework, which we'll talk about in a minute, how do we diagnose that? What's going on? What are the behavioural dimensions which are shaping behaviour? And that then leads us to a set of design principles that we can draw on to say, right, now we know what's going on in terms of the diagnosis. Now we can find a way to design things, design the interventions to overcome that. And now what are the mechanisms we're going to use to deliver on that, and how are we going to test that? And those, it's in a sense, oftentimes this is not fundamentally different to the steps you take in a typical market research or consulting project. But what behavioural science is doing is providing some, well, science-based scaffolding to really facilitate the way in which we go about driving change. So our framework is called MAPS. It's again, sort of relatively straightforward. Let's, motivation. Do you actually want to do something? Do I want to wear a face mask? Ability. Am I able to do it? Sometimes things you think, surely wearing a face mask is straightforward, isn't it? Well, there's lots of different kind of ways to, complexities about navigating wearing a face mask, and processing. Perhaps we don't necessarily, how we think about it. We don't necessarily automatically think about wearing a face mask. How many of us have found ourselves in a shop? I'm not quite sure what regulations are in Denmark, but I suspect that in retail units you are having to wear a face mask. But how many of us have gone in and then suddenly thought, oh, hang on, I've walked in without one? And that's where we typically locate some of the more automatic mechanisms that like heuristics and biases and so on. But then physical, does the context, does the environment actually allow for that? And I remember early on, of course, we couldn't buy face masks, so you might be motivated to do it, you might be able to do it, you might remember to do it, but if there's no face masks, then you can't do it. But also the other thing which is often missed is social and cultural perspectives, social norms. What are other people doing? Clearly important in shaping our behaviour. But as we see, and we're seeing sort of played out on our screens, the way in which cultural values really are important in shaping our behaviour as well. So these are all sort of mechanisms which we need to understand, and we've got subcategories in here as well we really dig into. This is based on a leading framework called COM-B. Lots of things we like about COM-B, some things we don't like about COM-B, but this is really designed in a way to get at lots of the kind of marketing challenges which we face, and be understandable. But importantly, two things: A, we need to make sure that we can link this through. First of all, this makes sure that we're covering the dimensions which are really important for driving behaviour change. That's most critical one. But B, really important, is that we don't just want to understand behaviour, we want to change behaviour. So we've got to make the linkage then, as we're talking about, through to intervention strategies. So just to give you a sort of quick example to sort of embed this, recipe boxes, as Rika was saying, these sorts of services had a huge uplift in terms of lockdown. What can the brand do in order to encourage this behaviour to stick? So that's the kind of challenge which we might often get thrown at us. So then the first stage of that is that so we've got clearly we've got the behavioural dimension, or the behaviour which we've defined. It's like people to continue with their purchase of with a subscription to recipe boxes. So then in terms of doing the diagnosis, this, then the sorts of things which we would look at are these sorts of things, right?
Yeah, so from the beginning, we could dive into a multitude of things. This is familiar for most of you on the call already, because we really do use creation quite a lot, not only to scope the issue at hand, but also to dive into existing information and repurposing this whole idea of not just conducting new data for the sake of data. We already know so many things to really scope the client's issues, but also the behavior that we know so well from working with a lot of partners over the years as well. Communities just enable us to have like a quick and fast way to ensure that the broad scope is investigated, but still having the attention to detail. Then we have, of course, the surveys where we're able to validate, generalize, and prioritize elements of the behavior change in question. So this is something that we regularly do, but of course, the new dimension about adding the behavioral science lenses and the knowledge that comes from working with the global team is, of course, challenging the existing way we scope issues and have these very fundamental issues at hand being uncovered in this process.
Yeah, and I think this is a sort of bit of a myth busting thing here. Is that because it's behavioral science, or that means we can't use familiar market research techniques? No, absolutely. We really integrate ourselves with those different techniques, and we use our framework to create questionnaire modules. Often, we've recently been doing this on. For globally around lots of issues around vaccination, lots of issues around return to work, lots of issues around the sorts of questions we got here, such as around recipe boxes. To get a kind of quick kind of understanding of what the issues are in terms of those dimensions is really important. And these are the kind of things which you come up with then. So some of the motivational dimensions is that I might say, look, I know I'll eat better if I can cook for myself. So what we would call outcome expectations. Great, so that's a positive. But actually, at the same time, we can pick up that someone's feeling anxious about that. There's a sense of anxiety amongst the recipe box users about the prospect of doing it so frequently. So what can we say? That's a problem. So you can see the kind of barriers and drivers which we get in a very familiar way. Ability, know how to use it, fine, not an issue. Don't need to think very carefully about using it. So people have kind of got into a routine. They kind of it's a bit more automatic. Don't have a place to store the box. Okay, that's a bit of a problem, and not a bit more of a kind of external environmental problem rather than necessarily a kind of inner sort of psychological issue. Perhaps then social norms. Yeah, but everyone else is stopping doing it now. Why would I continue? So you can see, these are things which are these are familiar kind of barriers and drivers. But what we are doing is we're locating them in a wider science psychological framework so we can get a different lens on them.
And exactly that is what we then use as the typical output that we see from many studies we've done previously, and then take it into the design aspect. And this is really where we see a difference in the approach that we typically apply to challenges in general. So this is creation of a workshop primarily, but here we have different building blocks to apply to the different challenges that we face. So it's really just about, for instance, understanding, essentially building knowledge, help people see relevance and importance in the stuff we're doing. We see a challenge, and then we can apply the strategy intervention that we really think needs to change this. And then planning, for instance, could be developing and maintaining intentions or skills needed to perform a behavior in a way. So remember a example where we were talking about internet security in a way. Mm-hmm. And this is really where we see different people have different mindsets. So the survey, the prioritization among 6 countries was really important for us to understand which intervention design we should potentially think in the lines of, depending on the different prioritization, because a lot of different people have a lot of different hesitations and issues when it comes to internet security. So this is really helpful in the design process when looking at the overall scope moving forward in the project.
Yeah, and a kind of classic thing around planning is set and forget. You know, it's just like okay, I'm going to set up my subscription, now I can forget about it. So encouraging people to do that, or putting your gym shoes by the front door so that you're all set for your lockdown run in the morning. So we can just to sort of bring this together so you can kind of see the way these phases work is that okay, so there's a motivational issue around emotion and anxiety. So what can we do? Well, okay, there's a way to manage that and facilitate some control around that. Perhaps we can think about offering a sort of way people can see how it can be used for other meals, leftover meal planner. You know, that's the sort of thing where we get together and workshop it through. We can think, okay, here we know the problem, here we've got the design principles, now how do we use it? So we make a change to the product. You know, or it may be that if we got seeing other people doing it, other people stopping their boxes, well, maybe actually we need to show people that other people are doing their boxes and maintaining their boxes. And so that's a bit more but what we call the sort of social connection as a design principle. And so and then using that in advertising or some sort of social media type work. So there's lots of sort of different routes we can go down, but fundamentally what we're doing is hopefully giving you a sense of, here's some scaffolding, here's a process, here's the scaffolding which we can be using in order to drive design principles into what we're doing, in order to drive the science in terms of what we're doing, because this is science which has demonstrated it works. It has an evidence base for sustained behaviour change, and that's a really, really important point to make, and we need to sort of bear in mind. Once we got these ideas, once we workshop these ideas, then of course we can do more. You know, we can turn on through to we typical workshop outputs are a bit can be a little bit sort of rough and ready, can't they, like? But then we've got a bit of a process which we go through in order to tune them up.
Yeah, I think this is really where a lot of the global network comes into play as well. So this is where we have a smaller number of interventions after this whole middle part has been conducted, right? So what we end up with is a smaller number of interventions identified based on the design phase and the diagnose phase, and these are then taken forward for prototype development. And this is, of course, a grand process where we, with the global team and the people in mind at the heart of the products, are really coming together to understand and refine how these elements, these changes, these interventions could actually look in real life. And then there's rounds of refinement and testing of prototypes before launch. And of course, these are prototypes, but it can be a lot of different things. We have a number of stuff. If you go to the next slide, then we can see, well, if it's a matter of direction, we can use Duel to have this fast prioritization where people instantly do trade-offs between different solutions. We have our famous concept product testing for innovation purposes, whether it's a taste test or it's an early concept that you would like to test somewhere. And this is really what we can do to take the interventions into the market again and see how they play out. Last but not least, we also have the instant labs, which is a really cool day, so to speak, where all stakeholders, clients, agencies get access to an online dashboard of people answers. And this is done in real time. And it enables us to modify different interventions design or creative directions, and then modify them, coming back to it, test it out again, coming back to it. And this is all done in one day. So we can really ensure that we have the right direction, test it out on consumers. It's doing what it's intended to do, and then we can look forward and bring it to the market. So this is a really fast way to also bring behavioral science and actual market research into play in a very, very short amount of time.
Yeah, and I think so. So this is the and these are all the things which we can do then, sort of prior to launch of those, to make sure that are we getting it right. And of course, we do randomized control trials as well. We do a lot of governmental work, public affairs work, but we work in all sorts of different contexts. So the testing which we do of the different sorts of interventions, well, it's highly variable. At one end, it might be sort of very light touch, just doing some qualitative work, for example. At the other end, these sorts of things which are very well tried and tested intervention methods, which are sort of familiar in a sort of more commercial brand context, or as we say, we can do the kind of randomized control trials as well. It does vary quite a lot in terms of the kind of testing which we then do to take it through, but you can kind of see the way in which this all works on an end-to-end basis. Just to round up, it might be useful to just take you through a case study of some work which we did for Reckitt Benckiser on air pollution products. This is work, I think it's about a year ago or so, and it was work done in a number of markets to understand what's going on in terms of people's purchase of masks to protect themselves against pollution. Now, the Reckitt have a sort of strong social purpose sort of dimension to what they do, but also, they're a business. They want to sell masks. So, in some ways, the content matter is sort of around social purpose to some extent, but also there's a very strong sort of mandate here, commercial mandate, also underpinning this, which is very familiar to many household goods companies, and this is very congruent with many of the questions which we may get. So there's a business challenge, there's a social purpose challenge, but fundamentally, well, look, how can we get people to wear masks to protect themselves against air pollution? The research challenge is that, well, look, what can we do? What is the behaviour change which how can we facilitate a behaviour change to lead to these tangible outcomes? How can we actually make this happen? I think this is the bit sometimes where we all need to apply our thinking hats a little bit, because the questions which we will often get asked by an organisation and the way in which they're articulated won't necessarily always say what the behaviour is that we're trying to change. And obviously there's lots of different ways in which lots of different behaviours involved in getting people to, or encouraging people to wear masks to protect themselves against air pollution. And there's lots of different elements to that. People need to understand the dangers. People need to be able to read the daily air pollution measures, the AQI numbers. They need to be able to know where they are, need to read them, need to understand them, they need to take the appropriate actions. We may have different groups of people who we want to be thinking about. There are different countries and so on and so forth. So you kind of need to think about, look, what is the behaviour here, which we're really trying to think about. And we got some, we'll often, sometimes it's clear, sometimes we need to just be a bit, think it through a little bit. It's not a huge task, but it's a task which needs to be done to keep ourselves sort of clear about what it is we're trying to affect here. So in this instance, we're looking at mask wearing, and the real focus was around getting parents to put masks on for their children, and upon leaving the house and for journeys outside the house. And so there's a bit of a focus. Now there were some other focuses for foci for the work, but this was this gives you a sense of, look, this is the sort of thing which we're trying to get to. There's a behaviour which we're trying to influence at the heart of this. So we used ethnography, and ethnography is many of you are aware, it's a great method for understanding behaviours in detail. You could substitute this for all sorts of other qualitative research. In other instances, quite often, what we're finding is that, as Riker was talking about earlier on, is that oftentimes our clients are researching researching an issue, trying to make change happen. So there's actually quite a big body of knowledge available. But in this instance, it was felt, look, we need to understand what's going on the ground a little bit more effectively, and let's understand the nuances, and let's understand, well, what are people understanding? How do people go about protecting themselves? And it's really interesting, and there's lots of film footage of it, and there's lots of sort of insights about the way in which people are using traditional remedies. They got faith in sort of using sort of noses and scarves to protect themselves rather than effective face masks. And then we're able to, importantly, then say, right, okay, now we've got this understanding. Now we can start structuring a questionnaire around that, using a behaviour change framework to be able to say, right, let's make sure we cover everything. And so now we can start seeing the way in which those different dimensions, those different behavioural drivers are represented. How important are they? How important are the motivational aspects? How important is sort of their different sort of perspectives in terms of outcome expectations to do with other products and how they will protect them, for example. So we're properly able to understand what's going on holistically, and doing a really effective diagnosis. Now, the next point, then, this is the workshop point, which Raika was talking about. This is where you can see on the left here, we've got all the different sorts of issues going on in terms of, look, these are the issues which are coming up. These are the sorts of barriers. This is how we translate those barriers into our behavioural framework. What we then do, and this is the really special thing about doing these sorts of behaviour change approaches, those link to design strategies. So we've got design strategies identified, which then say, okay, if you've got this class of barrier, here is the way in which you go about tackling that and unpicking it, and designing interventions to deal with it. Oops, I'm going to just, here's an example of one of the interventions that came out of that. I think and hope it'll start playing, but we can never quite tell.
बेवकूफी नहीं, AQI मतलब पॉल्यूशन। सांप बाबा का AQI 50 होता है और अभी AQI 350 है। अगर ज्यादा सांस लिया ना, अस्थमा हो सकता है। Air pollution can reduce your child's capacity by half a lung. Dettol City Shield का N95 mask जो दे 98% filtration. Pollution में भी रखे आपकी हर सांस स्वच्छ।
Okay, so you hopefully so that was one of the things which came out, is just using a film or used on social media, which was really directly built from a number of those different dimensions going on there. There's an understanding element, there's a sort of there's an identity element in there, there's an outcome expectation element. All of these things really just work right the way through, right from what the behavioural challenge is through to diagnosing it. Now let's really bake those into the intervention which we create as a result of it. Lots of work as well with social media influencers, normalizing mask wearing, because there's all sorts of issues around social norms. And so the client was really happy with it. Success of it has been also just making this sort of the invisible visible. And so part of that is just creating this sort of salience around it, disrupting our processing element of it, so people can kind of more sort of see, and there's a sort of more sort of emotional and salient aspect of it. Out of home, there's also this, again, that's a sort of disrupting our sort of more automatic processing around it. So say, yeah, look, remember, you need to be wearing a mask here in this environment. And having that kind of hard-hitting message delivered by children, and sort of understanding, actually, look, it's relevant to me. There's as I say, there's the identity issue around that, and then creating new behaviours and sort of normalising those behaviours. All of that led to an increase in sales, which they were very happy with this particular project. So you can see, look, even though that's this is a social purpose type of a project, you can see the way, then the principles that can be applied to all sorts of different research challenges. So hopefully what we've done is given you a kind of, a good sort of overall sense of you know, what this is, how do we apply it, you know, what are the things which we do in order to drive behavior, and by the way, you know, some of the kind of key things which come up time and again, which we perhaps see through that, is that, you know, the things which really make behavior tend to stick are around things around to do with, you know, how you see yourself, you know, your identity, whether or not this thing is something which you personally want to do and aligns with your goals, you know, and do you also, is it the kind of thing which is actually okay to do? It's reason, you know, it's enjoyable, you know. So these are the kind of things which often come up. But you know, hopefully you'll see that you know, as this point here is that we can't just rely on just those simple, you know, those rules in and of themselves. We need to really understand and properly diagnose the issue. We need holistic approaches. So just thinking we can solve everything with nudge, like the piano staircase, isn't enough. We need much more holistic approaches. Nudge is part of it, but it's not all of it. So hopefully what we've done is through Riker and myself just talking you through it, that the marriage that comes with integrating behavioural science with market research really gives us something powerful here. We can really tackle a wide range of change challenges, and we do across our daily business, trust me. And then our network, of which Riker's a part, means that we're in a position to do this. You know, we can integrate it into our programs globally, and that's very much part of, you know, what we are doing. We're working together to bake this in, to codify it into the work which we do, as you saw from earlier on. So hopefully we've been able to sort of really sort of give you a good sense of that over the course of this morning. And I guess here is the place where we get your burning questions. So we've got a few minutes if there are any. So do we over to you now to throw anything at us. And I think some people have been sort of possibly texting Nicolene. So
yeah, I can read it out. Can you advise me on what sorts of projects this sort of approach is most relevant?
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, isn't it, Raiko? I think that typically, in a sense, I think it can be used across a wide range of different issues. I think where we tend to use it more is where we're trying to ask the consumer to make a slightly more fundamental change in what they do. So if we're just asking them to, you know, I don't know, maybe let's use the example of shampoo. If they've always bought the same shampoo and we want them to continue to do so, well, actually, you know, usual methods work pretty well. You know, we kind of the advertising and so on, you know, and the methods and the install promotions, you know, that's understood, you know, and the mechanisms there are fairly clear. But if we're trying to get people to move to solid shampoo, well, that's a bit more of a challenge from a consumer perspective. So it's where we're kind of making those sorts of shifts, or, you know, perhaps getting people to use electronic vehicle charging, for example, at refill stations. You know, how do we encourage that? I think oftentimes it's those tricky questions where we try to sort of shift consumer behaviour, but it's just not happening. Then taking a slightly different lens to it sort of helps us to do that.
Does that cover the question? I think.
So do we have examples of nudging that that do not involve heavy marketing investments? Yes, I mean, most of the work which we do, I think, doesn't necessarily result in TV commercials. You know, we're doing some work at the moment for a cereals company, and a lot of that work is really around working with influencers. It's working with point of sale. It's doing sampling, encouraging sampling and trial. So So, you know, it's not, you know, oftentimes it is those smaller things which we're involved in, rather than necessarily the sort of hefty TV commercials, which can run on their own kind of rails, as it were, you know. But, you know, at times also there we're involved, and we're working with the advertising agency and sort of feeding into the advertising agency whilst they're facilitating things. But so I think you know, yes, absolutely, you know, exactly, all, you know, all those, the way in which we deliver it is very much dependent upon what our client has available, you know, and it's all about the art of the possible. So and then where does it fit on the ethics spectrum? I think we talked about this quite a lot, haven't we, Raika? And I think if you're just involved in a kind of straight nudge type activity of just sort of managing the individual rather than engaging with them, then you tip into something which is a little less ethical. But if what you're doing is thinking, okay, if your mindset is how do we facilitate the behavior, then I think it's a different perspective. I think it's much more ethical. And ultimately, let's face it, you're not going to, if someone fundamentally doesn't want to do it, then they're not going to do it. And you need to understand why they don't want to do it, and then work with them. You know, you've got to go with the grain of that person rather than trying to fundamentally change it. So I think the sort of this notion of hacking, yeah, I don't particularly like that term or that kind of approach. I think it is you know, we're much more of a mindset that oftentimes people will want to be doing something, you know, and they will say they want to do it, but then they struggle in order to enact it, and that's where you see these say-do gaps emerging, which which then we just think about, okay, how do we go about closing that? Okay, what are the barriers? How do we overcome those barriers?
I think we have another one. Do you recommend other measures for understanding Gen Z than other target groups?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a sort of wider market research question rather than necessarily a behavioural science question. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, Raika. I put you on the spot there.
No, I think this is something that we've seen before, and not that there's one measure fits all in order to target it, particularly Gen Z, but it really has to do with, from the behavioral science lens, to really just dive into the measures that apply here. So what are the typical motivations? What are the typical challenges we see for this specific target group? So when reaching these people, it's important to understand why it is they do the way they do, and that can be from a number of different methods. In a way, I would firstly recommend getting them in the room, because there is loads to do with just observing them, and immersions of some sort would be a great way to actually be more in the shoes of the consumers in that respect. So trying to understand the emotions, the motivations of this specific target group, we really do see that getting closer to them in the physical shape are working quite well, instead of just listening to what they say online, because this is the most, of course, internet-heavy generation. So this is one of the things that could broaden our horizon on what they say and do in attitudes. Not that they're not relevant in online surveys, they definitely are. We just see in the shape of behavioral science that there might be nuances that we could further explore once we have them and immerse ourselves on their shopper mission or whatever it might be.
Yeah, sounds fair enough to me. And we've got another one about, do you need a pre and post test of the behaviour to know whether or not the behaviour changes? Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, a lot of the time our clients do have tracking measures of these behaviours. You know, this is a thing which we're not short of necessarily, is to say, well, look, you know, what are the sales? You know, I mean, that's in a way, sort of at a meta level. Yes, we don't necessarily always have that for those particular groups, and that would be the ideal. totally agree. And some form of measurement of that behaviour, evaluation of whether that has changed, and we can then see. So absolutely yes. But I think that we don't always have that luxury. Our clients don't always have the money to invest in that. So I think we've got to just sort of be pragmatic here about sort of how do we approach this. And yes, there's the gold standard. There's always the gold standard. But then we've got to just think, well, look, actually, we can't always afford the gold standard. So how do we approach this in a pragmatic way and provide a kind of, and then we go back to look the kind of approaches which we often do in any case in a market research industry, you know, offer us pretty damn good tools, as it were. And what we're doing here is providing more scaffolding, providing more support, for really focusing on change and delivering change. So yes, agreed. And you know, as I say, there's a sort of in an ideal world, we would have much more, you know, experimental work and much more structured evaluation type work, and we do quite a bit of that work, but it's not always possible given time constraints and budgetary constraints and so on. So it's really about the art of the possible and being a kind of sensible, thoughtful practitioner on these things, and in integrating good practice. So, but yes, you know, we'd love to. I think we're pretty much on time, unless there is anything. I think we can stay on for a bit longer if anyone's got any other questions or comments. I think we're pretty much on time. So is there anything else, Rika, from your side?
No, I just think just reflecting a bit on the example of nudging that doesn't involve heavy marketing investments, right? I do think that we've seen this quite a lot in just thinking about the actual strategy that we take from the different studies that we do. Most of the times, employ a direction that could tap into a nudge from all the existing work that a lot of our clients do already. And I think this is really one of the minor aspects of the benefits of applying behavioral science right now in the processes that we already take and do with a lot of projects. So I just think it's super practical, and it's super important to just have that in mind when we do regular projects all together.
Yeah. I think what we're not doing is behavioural science as an entirely fundamentally different bit of sort of some clever people doing some magic in the corner. That's not what we're about. We're about very practical scaffolding, scaling, and integrating it into the work which we do, but also taking it as a new lens to existing work which we've done and saying, look, what new lessons can we learn from that? What can we learn from all this investment which has already been made in order to help drive things? So I think we're on time. I
feel like people have had their opportunity to ask the questions, and now we just got a nice comment. Thanks for all the good insights. Well, you're always more than welcome to follow up with Colin or myself after this. If you all of a sudden think of something you would like to ask us, we're here. So please reach out if anything. I would just like to thank Colin. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think we just need to do the plug for the next webinar.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We have the last webinar on December 10th, where we look at the trends for 21 and beyond. So if you haven't already signed up for that, please do so. And thank you, Colin. It was very nice that you would like to get up early for us.
No, not at all. Unfortunately, I'm always up at this time. But thank you very much for having me, and nice to be talking with you as ever, Rika, and looking forward to working with you on as we go forward in integrating behavioural science, behaviour change with the research which we're doing for the people here today. So that's been great. Okay, so thanks very much, and talk soon.
Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.